I'm getting over the flu, so if my voice is a little rough this morning or if I start coughing, that's why. But we are continuing our study of Genesis. We're on week 12 about Joseph's rise. We got one more week of our lesson, and then it'll be on to 1 Thessalonians. So a sense of alienation pervades the entire text of Genesis. It begins with the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden. Humanity has been driven from its home, and the world itself is now an alien place. Sin and guilt have led to estrangement of every kind, and the cry of Cain is a cry of all. I am cast out from the presence of God, of both God and the rest of humanity. Dwayne A. Garrett's Rethinking Genesis, which I think is an apt quote because that's where Joseph finds himself. We last left off, Joseph is in prison. He interpreted the dream of the chef and the cupbearer, and the cupbearer forgot to honor his end of the deal in, telling Pharaoh about him. So Joseph is languishing in prison again. So here is again my bibliography. If you want my slides, I can email them to you, or you can speak to Ray back in the sound room. So the objective of today is to understand the ugliness of jealousy, understand how others react to a person of faith, and understand the courage it takes to forgive. So let us begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time to study your word, and let it deepen our understanding of your love for us and what you require of us, Lord, and just let the lessons of Joseph's life strengthen us in our own walk, Lord, and just be with us as we go out into the world. In your name, amen. So, which Pharaoh did Joseph serve under? It's hard to say for certain, but Joseph's time in Egypt is probably in what is called the second intermediate period between 1700 to 1550 BC. It's a time of civil wars and famines. Why doesn't Genesis record the Pharaoh? Well, it was common practice during Moses' time to not refer to the Pharaoh by name, but only as king. This changed by the time we get to the divided kingdom period. Also, using Pharaoh in Genesis is an anachronism. It wasn't until after Moses' time that the Egyptians started calling their ruler Pharaoh. So this would be a later editor updating the name. And it is in the Hebrew just Pharaoh, transliterated into the Semitic. This period is known as the Hyksos period as well. Hyksos means foreign rulers. As we saw with Abraham, Canaanites commonly immigrated to Egypt because of famine. Soon they had enough numbers to start exerting political control and eventually took over the lower kingdom as the northern Egypt around the delta. The Hyksos pharaohs, which is the 15th dynasty, were displaced Canaanites, primarily Amorites. They controlled all of Egypt, though the native Egyptians had their own pharaohs in Thebes to the south who paid tribute to the Asiatic rulers. It's hard to say for sure which pharaoh Joseph served under. When the Egyptians retook power, which would lead into the oppression the Israelites experienced in the time of Moses, the Egyptians destroyed a lot of the monuments of the Hyksos pharaohs. Maceus Andrews argues that Potiphar served Pharaoh Khaon, the first pharaoh of the Hyksos and of the 15th dynasty. His rule was only 10 years, so the pharaoh of the famine would be Apophis. Again, this is a deduction, but it would fit the time. The 15th dynasty lasted about 108 years, so it could have been another pharaoh. By the time we get to Moses, the native Egyptians have reclaimed the power of Egypt and do not like the Semitic people, leading to the brutal persecution of the Israelites during probably the 18th dynasty. So here's some archaeological evidence for Joseph in Egypt. Again, the second intermediate period is very fragmented and not well preserved. So it's hard for Egyptologists to even be sure which pharaoh is in what dynasty. Names of viziers and other officials is very spotty too. Chariots, while known to Egyptians a little earlier than this time, did not see wide-scale adoption until the Hyksos pharaohs brought them into Egypt, probably explaining their military domination over the nation. Chariots are mentioned quite often in association with Joseph. The Hyksos pharaohs were known to have fully adopted Egyptian customs, and many native Egyptians would serve in their courts. To figure out their own past, they embraced Egyptian prejudices, explaining their disdain to the provincial Israelite shepherds. Egyptians also favored cattle for livestock and saw the sacrifice of lambs as profane, This is why Moses actually asked for the Israelites to leave Egypt to make sacrifices. So Potipharah is likely the Egyptian form of both Potiphar and Potipharah, and Az-Enet is the Egyptian form of Joseph's wife Asenath, which means she belongs to you. Both names are attested in the Egyptian record of the time. Joseph's Egyptian name, Zaphenath Paneah, is a Hebrew transliteration of an Egyptian name. Zaphenath means who is called, and Paneah is, in Egyptian, is Ipa Ankh, it means life. So the name is Joseph Zaphenath Paneah, or Joseph who is called Ipi Ankh. There is record of other Semitic people who have this style where their original name is followed by their Egyptian name. Ankh was also a common root found in vizier names of the time. Further, the name Ipi Ankh fell out of usage by the time of Moses. Dream interpretation was all the rage in this time, as was using a cup for divination, as we'll see in Genesis 45, verse 5, which is the cup that is put in Benjamin's sack. That was being used by Joseph for divination. The ideal age for an Egyptian to die was 110 years. This is the same age as Joseph when he dies, saying that he was the perfect Egyptian. There are several major famines attested in the Hyksos period as well. Joseph's story is often thought of as a migration epic. These are common stories about how a people started in one place and ended in another. Virgil's Aeneid is a famous example of this, which recounts how the survivors of the fall of Troy eventually settled in Rome. The difference is Joseph's account lacks any of the mythological events and backstory of its story, grounding Joseph's story in a historical setting, as we see quite often in Genesis. So, 2 years later, so Joseph's been in prison for 2 years, Pharaoh has a dream. He is standing by the Nile. He sees 7 cows that are fat, which are then devoured by 7 emaciated cows. And a second dream of 7 healthy ears of grain and 7 withered. So in the morning, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. The chief cupbearer remembers Joseph. He wasn't willing to help a Hebrew prisoner for no gain before, but now he has a chance to curry favor with Pharaoh and suggests him. Pharaoh sends for Joseph, who says he doesn't interpret dreams, but God does. He merely receives the meaning from the Lord. The dreams mean that there will be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. The fact that dreams are told twice means this is a fixed event. It will not be changed by God, implying some prophecies are conditional, but not this one. Further, God advises Pharaoh to hire a discerning man to oversee the stockpiling of the food during the plentiful years as reserve against the lean years. Pharaoh decides Joseph is such a discerning and wise man who has the favor of God. He makes Joseph second in Egypt, only behind Pharaoh in authority, giving Joseph his signet ring. Therefore, whatever Joseph does, he does in Pharaoh's name. Joseph is renamed Zaphenath Paneah and given Asnah, daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On. Now On is a city dedicated to the worship of Ra, the sun god. Joseph is only 30 years old, and he is often seen as a type of Jesus. Through Joseph, the house of Israel is delivered from death by his resurrection after being sold into slavery. He rises to become the second most powerful man in Egypt. So it's not surprising to see he is 30 when he starts his ministry. Further, do you know that most Jews believe that there are 2 different types of messiahs? I was actually surprised to find this out. We often think the Jews saw the Messiah sort of a second coming of David, Messiah ben David, they would call that version of him. But they also recognize other prophecies that seem to be talking about a different type of Messiah, who they called Messiah ben Joseph, such as Zechariah 9 through 10, which speaks of a peaceful king. Like in verse 10b, it says, he shall speak peace to the nations. This is just my speculation here, but this might be why we need a second coming, because Jesus has 2 different types of messiahs to fulfill. How do you think Joseph's life thus far has prepared him for this great task? He was a manager for Potiphar first, yeah. Yeah, so that gave him practical experience running a household, which he can then expound to running an entire nation. Yeah. Yeah, so that his time administering the prison while he was in jail, that also gave him more experience in this matter too, yes. Yes?
He had to use problem-solving skills to overcome each of the negative things he had to deal with. Because it looks like first, he's getting somewhere, and then he has to run from Potiphar's wife. So he could have given in to her and just reaped everything that was there, but he chose to stay faithful to God and work out this problem by escaping. He also has to solve problems in each of his authority times where he was manager for Potiphar, when he had authority in the jail. So each one of those situations are preparing him for the larger salt problem that he is given by Pharaoh. And he says, well, why don't you put a guy in charge? Who would have thought that just a lowly guy would have said, hey, Pharaoh, why don't you do this? Because most people would not, they would have been very quiet and waited till Pharaoh said something to them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Not just the fact he had the experience going through it, but the fact that that when he disadvises Pharaoh to use a discerning man, he doesn't put himself up for it. That's something to note. He didn't take advantage of that to seek power. That's true. So he's a humble man, yes.
I think his ability, or how God spoke to him through dreams, and his ability to interpret dreams prepared him for this because he saw what was coming before it happened.
Yeah, so he was prepared for this through God's dreams. Is that what you're saying? That the dreams God showed him prepared him for this? Okay. Yeah, I can see that. Any other comments? Yes, Miss Jackie.
Ultimately, he has recognized the hand of God in everything that happened, and has seen how God had worked through all of these things up to that point.
Yeah.
So he was definitely spiritually strengthened, knowing that his power and strength came from God.
Yeah, so Joseph could see the hand of God working in his life through every situation he's in, something that he is going to acknowledge later on with his brothers when he says, you sold me to slavery, but it was really God that did this. Yeah. Any other comments? All right. So Joseph rises to power. So Joseph stockpiles as much food as he can in storehouses throughout Egypt for the next 7 years. During this time, he and Asna have 2 sons. Manasseh is the firstborn, whom he named such because God made me forget all my hardships and all my father's house. So kind of tells you what his feelings are about being sold into slavery by his brothers. Then they have Ephraim. Joseph names him thus because, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Manasseh literally means forgetfulness, and Ephraim means double fruitfulness. So I think we can see how Joseph feels about what happened to him and how he considers Egypt to be his home now. He has a new family, and he's moving on from the betrayal of his family. The seven plenty years end and the famine begins. It spreads into Canaan. However, because of Joseph, there is bread in Egypt. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. I would want to point out that this would be the sort of local earth, right? That is sort of the known world of the Near East, right? This wouldn't be the entire world. It's just more hyperbole, right, to show just how far-reaching this famine is. It's a really bad one. Back in Canaan, Jacob learns there's grain in Egypt. He sends all his sons but Benjamin to buy grain, dreading they'll die without it. He holds Benjamin back out of fear. Don't think Benjamin is a child, though. He would be a fully grown man by now, but he is Rachel's last son. In fact, he has like 10 sons when we see him, when the whole family immigrates down to Egypt. So I don't actually know how he had that many kids, but he does. He has 10 sons. The brothers are brought to Joseph because everyone has to come to Joseph to buy grain. They bow to their brother, not knowing who he is, fulfilling his dreams. Joseph recognized them, but they don't recognize him. He would look Egyptian now, shaved face, wearing linens, his skin pale from working indoors. Joseph treats them like strangers and lowly Semitic shepherds. He accuses them of being spies, taking advantage of the famine to spy out Egypt's weak points. They protest, saying they are the sons of one man. Originally there were 12, but one died and the other was with their father. Joseph says to have one go and fetch the younger brother, while he keeps the others in prison to prove they're not spies. Well, they must have refused this command because he imprisons them for 3 days. Then offers to have only one brother stay behind while the rest return with grain, but they must bring back the youngest to buy the freedom of the imprisoned brother. The brothers argue in their native tongue and realize this is happening because of what they did to Joseph. Reuben says he warned them not to do anything to Joseph because a reckoning has found them. They see this as divine justice at work. They don't know that Joseph can understand them because he's speaking Egyptian and using an interpreter so far. At this point, he excuses himself and weeps in private. When he returns, he seizes Simeon and binds him. Then he sends the rest home with the grain and secretly with their money. Sometime after leaving, the brothers find the money in their packs and are frightened. They fear what's happened and that they have to return with Benjamin to free Simeon. Jacob has lost Joseph, thinks he's lost Simeon, and is terrified he'll now lose Benjamin. He refuses. Reuben pledges the lives of his 2 sons if he fails to bring Benjamin home. Jacob says he will die if he loses Rachel's last son and does not relent. So why is Joseph doing all this? I mean, this is a pretty elaborate game. This is the most elaborate scheme we see in Genesis.
I think he wants to know the heart of these men. And I think he becomes aware that this is the fulfilling of one of his dreams. It's interesting, though, that he's insisting on having their youngest son brought. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, so Don's point is that he's testing their hearts to figure out how they're going to react to the situation. And plus he does want to see his younger brother Benjamin, the one brother that wasn't involved in selling him off into slavery. That's true.
In a way, it could be getting back at his brothers. They had, last time we saw them, they were talking about killing him. They took off his robe, and they hated him because of the dreams. And so maybe he's just goading them a little bit since he has the power to do that.
Yeah, I don't think he is trying to get back at them. He does return the money to them. And when they return, we'll see that he says, no, you paid me. So he lies and says that, he got the money, that however they got this money, it wasn't because he gave it to them. So he does. I don't think that's it. I think it's more he's trying to sound their hearts. Yeah.
And it does exhibit his compassion for his brothers, and then he did order his servant to return the money in their bags. And so the servant did his job, Joseph received the money, and if Joseph chose to give the money away, that was a gift from the heart of Joseph.
It's true that is a gift from the heart of Joseph. And I think another reason is that if they think that they failed to pay, they'd be less likely to return and ransom Simeon. That might be another part of the test, to add one more pressure point to it. family runs out of grain. So some time has passed. Jacob sends them to buy more grain, but Judah reminds their father that without Benjamin, they can't buy any more grain. Jacob is mad they even brought up Benjamin, but the brothers, to Joseph, the brothers were just being honest. And Judah said to Israel, his father, "Send the boy with me, and we will rise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and also our little ones." So again, Benjamin is at least 20. He has 10 sons. So maybe he had a bunch of twins. I don't know. Maybe he had multiple wives. I think he has more sons than any of the other brothers. "I will be a pledge of safety," Judah continues. "From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. If we had not delayed, we would now have returned twice." So we can see how long it's been. They could have made this trip twice. We later find out that we're in the second year of the famine. Jacob relents. Reuben's pledge did not work, but Judah's did. We see Judah is sliding into that firstborn position. He's going to be the one, his family gets the kingship. As we see later that Reuben, Levi, and Simeon have all lost the firstborn position because of the things they did. Jacob sends them with delicacies from Canaan: honey, balm, gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds, along with twice the money to pay for the first trip's grain. Jacob prays for God's mercy on them and for a safe return of Benjamin and Simeon. The group reaches Joseph, and Joseph sees his little brother. He orders his steward to slaughter an animal and throw a feast. He brings the brothers to his house, which scares them. They don't understand why they're here. They explain how they found their money in their sacks and did not steal. Joseph tells them not to fear because he was paid. He says, "God put the money in your sacks." Joseph brings out Simeon and tells them they will eat at noon. He provides them water to wash up. When Joseph arrived at his palace, his brothers brought to him their gifts that they had carried with them and bowed to the ground in front of him. Joseph asked them how they had been doing. "Is your father well? The older gentleman about whom you spoke," he inquired. "Is he still alive?" "Your servant, our father, is doing well," they replied. "He is still alive." Then they bowed down in humility. As Joseph looked up and recognized his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, "Is this your youngest brother about whom you spoke to me?" And he addressed him directly, "May God be gracious to you, my son." At this, Joseph hurried out, deeply moved because of his brother, and looked for a place to weep by himself. He entered his personal quarters, wept there a while. Now, the Hebrew word for wept here is rahamim. It is the plural form of the word womb, which is a very interesting word to use for weep, the plural of womb. It's as if it's a sort of weeping that only can be done for one brother to another, to the one that he shared a womb with, is kind of what the Hebrew is implying there. Then he washed his face and came out. Barely controlling himself, he ordered his staff to serve the meal. Joseph's staff served him by himself, his brothers separately, and the Egyptian staff members by themselves, because the Egyptians wouldn't take their meal with the Hebrews, since doing so was detestable for the Egyptians. We learn from Herodotus in his histories that the Egyptians just have a sort of superiority complex to everybody. They had an expression that was like, "never kiss a Greek." So they just are kind of racist to everybody. Meanwhile, the brothers were seated in front of Joseph in birth order, from firstborn to youngest. The men stared at one another in astonishment. Joseph himself brought portions to them from his own table, except that he provided to Benjamin 5 times as much as he did for each of the others. So they feasted together and drank freely with Joseph. Once more, Joseph has his servants return the brothers' money to their sacks. He also has them place his divination cup in Benjamin's sack. This cup or chalice was used by the Egyptians for divination. Verse 6 is explicit on this. One way that this was done was to mix water and oil. The other was to pour it on the floor and just sort of see the swirl of patterns. In both, you study for any emerging patterns or how light reflects, and then interpret it. Joseph claims in verse 15 that he learned of the brothers' theft by divination, but does Joseph actually practice this art? It's later forbidden in the Levitical code, but we've seen other patriarchs do forbidden things in this time. The brothers leave, and Joseph sends his servant to overtake them and accuse them of theft, not stealth. It's like Rachel and the terebinth that she stole earlier in Genesis. This time the brothers know they're innocent, and like Jacob before them, they say whoever stole the cup should be put to death. The brothers are then horrified when it's found in Benjamin's sack and tear their clothes. They are free to go, but they all travel back to Joseph with their arrested brother. There the brothers beg for clemency. If Benjamin doesn't return, their father will surely die. They swore to see him back safely. He is their father's favored son, and they have the chance to leave him and they had the chance to leave him for Egyptian justice. To them, it must seem like Benjamin's a thief, yet they will not abandon him, maybe just for their father's sake. Then Judah offers a pledge. Remember again whose idea it was to sell Joseph into slavery. Now therefore, please, let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. Judah offers to sell himself into slavery to save Benjamin. And then, weirdly, in Targum Neophiti, the rabbi there inserts a very long speech from Judah. In the middle of his very humble plea, in it he says if any harm comes to Benjamin, he will personally kill Joseph, then every man in Egypt, and lastly the Pharaoh. He points out his brothers Simeon and Levi depopulated a town once, and he's a mightier warrior than them. It's also weird that he does take the time to say Dinah is their sister, but has no part of their inheritance, which seems very out of place. He even roars like a lion. Then he goes back to acting like a meek and subservient like he does in the text in Genesis. So I just want to throw that in there because it was one of the most bizarre things I read in Targum Neophiti.
Explain that last bullet point there. That's a quote from...
So Targum Neophiti is one of the Aramaic Targums. It's a rabbi's paraphrase. And so they add stuff in. And they add this huge long speech about how amazing Judah is and how he'll murder everyone in Egypt in the middle of him being very humble. And then he suddenly has this big braggadocious claim, and then he goes back to being humble. It was one of the weirdest things I read in Targum Neophiti. And I just had to share it. So, what lessons can we apply in our lives from Judah's request?
You can make big requests even though how you got there can be very wrong. And with a humble heart, you can be repentant in your request and yet know that there's something bigger that is happening along the way.
Okay, so you're saying is that he's being repentant here, even though what led him here was him being not sinful, and so therefore he's making this big request because he is being repentful, and that's something we should remember, that just, we are all sinners, right, and we've all done bad things, but that doesn't mean we don't deserve asking things from God. Is that what you're trying to say? All right, that's pretty good.
He displays sacrificial love. He's basically offering himself up in place of his brother. He does it, probably partly out of compassion for Benjamin, but certainly out of compassion for his father and what it would do to him. It also shows a lot of accountability on his part, being willing to kind of fall on the sword for the brothers.
Yeah, so it is a demonstration of sacrificial love, because Judah's innocent here, right? As far as he must understand it, Benjamin is a thief, but he's willing to take his punishment, for the sake of his father at the very least, if not for his brother. And he acknowledges that it's his father's favorite son, so this would be a good way to get rid of him again, but that's not what they do here. All right. Wow, that's all we got for this week. Any other comments about what we discussed?
Judah did tell Benjamin's safety. So seeing that Benjamin's safety is now in jeopardy, he is fulfilling his promise to his father.
Yeah, so Judah did swear an oath to his father that he would make sure that Benjamin is brought back. And so therefore he is fulfilling that oath to him. Yeah, that is important. Yes, Don?
I find it interesting that Jacob had a history of deceiving his brother and being deceived. He was deceived by Laban, and now he's being deceived because his son Joseph is alive. I also find it interesting a case of having a multiple wives and a favorite wife. That's just not a good idea. And I also find it interesting about favoritism. I call that child abuse. So if you happen to have 12 sons and a daughter, to pick one of them as a favorite is not healthy. And I see people often who felt, what's a nice word, like left out or leftovers because another sibling was the favorite child. And that's just not a godly way to raise a family.
Yeah, so Don's point is that having a favorite son is like child abuse. And that's a very good point, that it does cause so much problems in the family. Also, having a favored wife, if you have multiple wives, is a bad idea. In fact, Leviticus, I want to say it's 17:17, warns against having multiple wives for that reason, because it turns them into rivals. Yes.
We also saw favoritism in Jacob's parents, because Rebekah favored Jacob and Isaac favored Esau, and it did not turn out well.
That's true.
And it's almost like that he learned favoritism from his parents and didn't correct it.
That's true. Jacob was the favorite son of Rebekah, and he prospered because of it. That is true. So this is maybe a learned behavior. Yeah.
It might make sense that we have that Judah story in the middle of Joseph's story so that we can connect the dots and understand that his heart changed after, through sons and the issue with Tamar and things like that. That might have changed his heart.
Ye-
Enough to then to be able to offer himself and take care of the situation.
Yeah, because we do have that interlude with Judah and Tamar where he is humiliated and has to admit that he's the one that's in the wrong, and that's maybe the start of his, character growth, right, as they would say. Yeah, that's true.
What we see with the story here of Judah offering himself as the slave, the prisoner, in place of Benjamin, is certainly a tremendous witness to the love that is shown, but it's also one of those lessons to us. We never know who's watching and who is seeing what we're doing. Joseph was seeing these brothers of his act in ways that were very different than he remembered. And
That as well, and yes.
I see in this a broad sweep of many, many decades of God's intervention to produce the outcomes God wants to see happen. But we as individuals see our lives in shorter segments, the disasters, the difficulties, the blessings. Perceive God in control.
Yeah, so Genesis shows us sort of the big picture of how God works slowly over time, and it's tends to be not, we're very finite creatures, and we're very much in the moment, and sometimes it's easy to forget that there's something greater at work when things are going bad for you. So that's something to remember, yes.
Also, the story also kind of parallels the story of our own salvation. You got, the father Jacob that has his favorite son Benjamin, who at least appeared to do something wrong and is about to essentially lose his life to slavery. So in the story, it's like Jacob kind of parallels God. We parallel Benjamin, and then you have Judah, who Jesus comes from the tribe of Judah, that basically offers himself in place of Benjamin, in place of us. So
Yeah, so it's a typology, what's happening here for salvation, where Benjamin is the one who should be punished, but then Judah, who Jesus comes from his line, is the one going to take the blame, yes. Yes.
There's a broader sweep here, and in the courses that I work with, this segment is combined in the phrase, the conflict between good and evil. And we've seen that throughout Genesis, this contrast defining for us in our own lives, a choice that we make between good and evil.
Right, so you're talking about how, we have a choice between good and evil, and we see that play out in Genesis, where the patriarchs have the choice between good and evil, and sometimes they choose good, sometimes they don't. And that's something we need to be keep mindful. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and that continues as we watch the story of Israel throughout the Old Testament, and leads to the burden that we feel of sin, understanding what sin is.
Yeah, and then we see this play out in Israel's relationship with God, and how they choose the bad more often than the good. And that's something we also struggle with, of course. Well, if we don't have any more comments, we're going to end with a prayer. Heavenly Father, again, thank you for this time to study your word, and let the lessons of Joseph's life and the decisions his brothers make just sit with us and strengthen us, Lord, and just let these lessons just strengthen us in our walk, Lord, and just be with us as we go out into the world, Lord, in your name. Amen.